Hey guys, tonight we will draw back the golden embroidered velvet curtain to step into the saddest and most disturbing story in royal history, the tale of Elizabeth I, the Queen of Absolute Pretense. Can you even imagine that the monarch who reigned over the dazzling golden age of England, who was celebrated as a pristine goddess, actually had to face teeth blackened by sugar and a body that smelled like a rotting corpse? This isn't a literary metaphor, it's the stark reality. Look at the magnificent portraits: porcelain, white skin, shimmering pearls, radiant authority. But behind that mask of poisonous lead powder was a woman who had not dared to touch water for many weeks, fearing water more than any foreign enemy. Her breath was heavy with the smell of decay, and her proud wig was a breeding ground for lice. The Tudor court was a world without toothpaste, without deodorant, and without modern plumbing. They lived with the belief that water would open the doors for disease to enter. And Elizabeth I, the symbol of a mighty empire, was the most devoted victim of that mistaken belief. She built her throne on a foundation of filth, concealing the rot with layers of silk and perfume. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please let me know where you are and what the local time is now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Horrific hygiene. Habit number 1. Applying pearl powder to the underarms. At the break of dawn, one of Queen Elizabeth I's ladies-in-waiting would slip quietly into her chamber, carrying a tray of finely ground pearl powder, a so-called royal hygiene, luxury concealing an unexpected horror. In an age lacking soap and clean water, the Queen decreed that powdered mother-of-pearl, brought all the way from Asia to adorn glittering jewelry and serve as diplomatic gifts, could also serve as a weapon against body odor. Each morning, before fastening her snug undergarments and lacing her corset tightly, Elizabeth would settle onto an intricately carved wooden chair, relax her arms, and close her eyes, while a maid used a small spoon to dust a layer approximately 1 millimeter thick of the white, silky powder onto the delicate skin beneath her arms. That powder layer was hailed as a crude armor, temporarily absorbing sweat and rendering the skin surface drier than it otherwise would be. In truth, pearl shell powder does not dissolve in water nor sweat. It adheres like a thin film, then, within a few hours, hardens into brittle flakes prone to crumbling. When the Queen gestured with her arm, flakes would cascade down, mixing with corset fibers, lead-based face powder, and body oils, to form a dense mass that crept into every skin fold and lodged itself in hair follicles. This exact mixture created an ideal breeding ground for bacteria and yeast, which multiplied with astonishing speed. The veteran ladies-in-waiting meticulously noted the ensuing changes. Once smooth porcelain, like skin turning dark, bruised and angry red, tiny blisters appearing in clusters. And, on some days, small painful sores. Instead of permitting the royal physicians to apply antiseptics or herbal salves to remove the flaking layer and soothe the irritation, Elizabeth insisted that her attendants simply apply a fresh coating of pearl powder each day. She believed this ritual preserved the radiant purity of her royal skin, even though beneath that fine layer lay a chronic, unhealing wound. At times, her attendants even mixed crushed eggshell or ground sea snail shell into the pearl powder to enhance its absorbent power. This secret blend only made the concoction sharper, further drying her skin until it peeled away in stubborn patches that then had to be recoated as a makeshift remedy. Early mornings were consumed by the labor of grinding pearls into a fine, sun-dried powder that would be stored in tightly sealed beeswax boxes to prevent moisture. As a result, the entire bedchamber was suffused with the scent of pearl dust, lead powder, and dry shell, an atmosphere so stifling that even the Queen's breath seemed heavier within it. Viewed through the lens of modern medicine, oil pulling with edible oils might have some limited benefit, but smothering one's underarms in thick pearl powder was skincare disaster on every level. That encasing layer compresses the pores, blocking natural perspiration and trapping toxins, leading to dermatitis, allergic reactions, and folliculitis. Every day, Elizabeth endured relentless itching, burning discomfort, and occasional sharp pains, but she persisted in maintaining her Tudor-era image of flawless alabaster, no matter the cost to her skin. Yet it was precisely that ostentatious powder layer that served as the true poison to her precious skin. Throughout her life, Elizabeth never realized that the substance she extolled as the purest of all was actually destroying her flesh from beneath, sowing chronic inflammation under each arm. Whenever she lifted her hands to greet her subjects, the powder shattered into fine dust that drifted down in a slow, mournful dance, a visual testament to the Queen's profound fatigue, luxury and power intertwined with silent agony. And so, after countless days of enduring this ritual, Elizabeth continued her pearl powder application, convinced that her royal mantle could not exist without it, despite the harsh reality that the powder neither cleansed nor cured, but simply imprisoned the crimes of bacteria and mercifully masked a queen's hidden suffering in the dawn's bright splendor. Horrific hygiene habit number 2. Foot hygiene with ash and dry cloth. In the dim light of dawn, long before the bustle of the Tudor court stirred, 2 of Queen Elizabeth I's ladies-in-waiting would tiptoe into her chamber. They carried nothing but a small bowl of powdered eggshell ash, or finely ground pearl powder, and a stiff, dry cloth. For the Queen, water was sacred and scarce. She firmly believed that washing her feet too often would break the life currents and bring on numbness or weakness. Thus, instead of a bath or a simple foot wash, Elizabeth insisted on this peculiar ritual of ash and cloth. Each morning, Elizabeth would recline on a velvet-cushioned settee, her back propped by silk pillows. A lady-in-waiting would gently lift one of her feet and sprinkle a thin layer of ash or powdered pearl across the instep, between the toes and along the heel. The mixture was said to absorb moisture and mask unpleasant odors. In practice, it offered no antiseptic properties whatsoever. It merely clung to the skin. After allowing the powder to settle for a few moments, the attendant would use the dry cloth to brush away excess ash, leaving behind a thin residue, slightly tacky yet somehow velvety to the touch. By midday, the Queen's carefully powdered feet had transformed. The once loose ash had absorbed sweat and compacted into stiff, crusty flakes. Those flakes intermingled with dust carried in on her high-heeled court shoes and fine silk stockings, forming a hardened layer of foot plaster. Cups of ground pearl or eggshell, sometimes combined with fragments of silk from her stockings, creating an almost concrete-like mask over her soles. The ladies-in-waiting recorded that this foot powder would crack and crumble audibly whenever the Queen shifted her weight or removed her footwear. When it came time to change her shoes, Elizabeth would sit at the edge of her bed. 2 attendants would draw up the silken bed curtains to shield her from prying eyes as they carefully removed the crusted stockings. There was no water or warm soak, only swift, fumbling with the dry cloth to brush off the brittle flakes. Any calluses or splits in the skin were never washed. Instead, they were smoothed over with a dab of perfumed oil and then immediately coated with fresh ash or pearl powder. The Queen viewed this as essential to preserving her vitality, even as the raw, cracked skin burned and itched beneath the mask of ash. By late afternoon, Elizabeth would often complain of itching and a prickling sensation in her heels and between her toes, but she swallowed her discomfort to maintain the ritual. The court viewed the lingering discomfort and faint but persistent odour not as evidence of poor hygiene, but rather as the aroma of nobility, a signifier of rank and privilege. No physician or attendant dared suggest that water might ease her suffering. To do so would have been to challenge the Queen's deeply held belief that moisture was the enemy of her strength. From a modern medical standpoint, this practice was disastrous. The ash and pearl powder could only remove superficial moisture without killing bacteria or fungi. The dry cloth merely spread the residue, embedding particles deeper into skin crevices and clogging sweat glands. Over time, the thick, unbroken barrier of powder obstructed natural perspiration, trapping toxins and leading to chronic skin irritation, infections, and athlete's foot. Yet Elizabeth persisted in the name of tradition, convinced that any contact with water would sap her power. And so, day after day, Queen Elizabeth I's feet endured the weight of her realm, suffocated under layers of ash and dried powder, each step an echo of silent torment. The ladies-in-waiting continued their solemn task, bound by loyalty, while the court accepted the Queen's discomfort as a symbol of her unyielding authority. In that quiet early morning ritual, The Queen's conviction in her own invincibility waged a secret war against her very flesh, one grain of ash at a time, beneath the fragile guise of regal decorum. Horrific hygiene habit number 3. Oil pulling with cooking oil. In an era when clean water was scarce and modern dental care unheard of, Queen Elizabeth I turned to a rural remedy for fresh breath: oil pulling with cooking oil. Each evening after grand banquets that lasted for hours, when she had to address her court or receive foreign ambassadors, she summoned her ladies in waiting and instructed them to pour a spoonful of olive oil or linseed oil into her mouth. Sitting in subdued candlelight, Elizabeth would hold the viscous liquid between her teeth, letting it slosh gently around her tongue and the roof of her mouth for about 20 to 30 seconds. Then she would lean forward and expel the oil into a silver basin, confident that it had drawn out the bacteria and foul odours, leaving her breath as sweet as the rosewater sprinkled in her chambers. This practice, what some modern enthusiasts still call oil pulling, might emulsify bits of food debris and surface plaque on the teeth and tongue, but it could not penetrate deeper into the gums or the narrow crevices between her molars. Worse, after 30 seconds of languid swishing, the oil absorbed not only malodors, but also bits of sugar residue and saliva enzymes, transforming into a rancid yellow-brown sludge. According to the Queen's chroniclers, the cloths used to wipe her lips afterward reeked of stale oil, and the ornate glass chalices meant to hold the spent liquid became stained with oil slicks that defied all attempts at cleaning with cloth or sand. On more than one occasion, foreign ambassadors remarked on Elizabeth's awkward demeanour immediately after this ritual. She would approach the dais, try to pronounce her opening lines of welcome, and there would be an audible slurp followed by a stifled gag when she expelled the final drop of oil caught behind her molars. One visiting envoy wrote that the Queen's breath afterward was not sweet as promised, but heavy with the thick stench of rancid grease, as if 1,000 frying pans had breathed within her mouth. Yet Tudor physicians, adhering to the prevailing miasmatic theory of disease, neither condemned nor wholeheartedly endorsed the practice. They simply noted that oil pulling was not disadvantageous. Though inferior to rinsing with aromatic herbal waters or fortified wine, both considered mild disinfectants. By adopting this habit, Elizabeth unwittingly kept her oral cavity in a persistently damp, oily state, an environment prime for yeast and bacterial overgrowth. As a result, her lips and inner cheeks often developed small sores and patches of thrush. Her ladies-in-waiting recorded frequent instructions to sprinkle powdered medicinal herbs such as thyme, rosemary, or mint into the tooth gaps, hoping the dry particles would absorb moisture and mask the odour. But those dry dustings only offered fleeting relief before the oil returned, mixing again with the herbal dust to form yet another foul paste trapped in the shadows of her teeth. Even more tragically, the Queen's reliance on oil pulling deprived her of the only true solvent for sugar and starch build-up water. With each nightly ritual, Elizabeth lost an opportunity to rinse away damaging food residues. Over time, her teeth decayed and blackened, falling out one by one until one side of her jaw was nearly toothless. Portraits produced for her court after the age of 30 depicted a serene, ageless majesty, but those in attendance knew the real Elizabeth could hardly chew her food, let alone speak without wincing. In the candlelit hush of Windsor Castle, Elizabeth would slip away from her bedchamber to swish oil while her attendants kept their voices low. It was a lonely practice, both intimate and absurd. The most powerful woman in Christendom, subsisting on oil to cleanse her mouth, in a world where a simple splash of water could have sufficed. Yet she persisted, convinced that the ritual upheld her dignity and safeguarded her health. This conviction, rooted in superstition and reinforced by courtly deference, sealed her fate. Her smile became brittle, her teeth fell into disrepair, and her speech grew slurred, yet she carried on, swishing oil like a sacrament. In the end, oil pulling may have offered Queen Elizabeth the illusion of cleanliness, but it delivered real harm. It kept her mouth perpetually oily and wet, sowing infection and decay. It perpetuated her reliance on a ritual that did nothing to uproot the underlying bacteria, and it left a legacy of dental ruin that no portrait, no public facade, could ever truly erase. Thus, the Queen of England, so feared and revered for her power and intellect, found herself defeated not by invaders or conspirators, but by the simple, oily residue of her own misguided hygiene practice. Horrific hygiene habit number 4. The Queen's parasite. Infested bed. When one imagines the royal bedchamber of Queen Elizabeth I, visions of carved oak, velvet draperies, and plush feather bedding may come to mind. Yet, behind that opulent facade lay a scene of silent horror. The Queen's own bed was a breeding ground for countless parasites. In the Tudor era, laundering heavy fabrics was deemed dangerous and expensive, so linens, mattresses, and pillows were rarely cleaned. Elizabeth's bed was comprised of layers of feather and straw materials that trapped moisture, body oils, and skin flakes, creating an ideal sanctuary for mites, fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Despite being the most private and sacred refuge for the sovereign, it was never fully washed or aired. Instead, it was simply hung with aromatic herbs and drapes of thick velvet to mask the stench. Each night, Elizabeth would recline in silence on what her ladies-in-waiting quietly dubbed the parasitic tapestry. Beneath the rich brocade coverlet and heavy duvets, tiny creatures stirred. Mites would scuttle across the tufted mattress. Bedbugs would emerge from crevices in the straw-filled tick to bite her flesh. Lice carried over from her powdered wigs and densely layered gowns found new hosts within the seams of her pillows. Even the Queen's cherished lapdogs and caged songbirds, brought to lend warmth and comfort, brought their own legions of parasites. These animals, beloved as companions, unwittingly deposited tick larvae and flea eggs amidst the feathers, spreading the infestation further. Her attendants, tasked with ensuring her comfort, would awake at dawn to shake out blankets and gently smooth the linen. They never removed the layers to launder the stuffing. Instead, they simply whipped down the top fabrics, plumped the pillows, and draped fresh sprigs of lavender and rosemary across the bed canopy. Those aromatic herbs, while pleasant to the nose, did nothing to halt the life cycle of the pests lurking within. Court secretaries noted with solemn fascination that several maids fainted upon entering the Queen's bedchamber, overcome by the dense, humid air, thick with the smell of herbs, sweat, and something darker, an unseen army crawling beneath the surface. The rustle of shifting bed linens became a nocturnal lullaby of discomfort. Elizabeth, exhausted from state matters, would lie motionless, only aware of a faint, insistent itch at her back, her hips, or behind her knees. She resisted scratching, fearing it might displace the carefully arranged draperies or disturb the elaborate canopies overhead. In the dim candlelight, lice would find refuge among her curls, then drift down onto her shoulders as she slept. The Queen's only defence was the ritual of fumigating the chamber with incense each morning, a spectacle of ritual that seemed more theatrical than sanitary. For all the grand tapestries depicting her triumphs, no tapestry could hide the truth. The monarch slept atop a living ecosystem. Scholars of the time recorded close-quarter meetings where courtiers discreetly dabbed handkerchiefs at their armpits after spending the night, citing the Queen's presence as the source of an inexplicable itch. Yet, no one dared complain openly. To question the purity of the Queen's bed was to challenge the divine right of her reign, and so traditions endured. No mattress overhaul, no replacement of straw, not even a simple airing in the open air, only the reapplication of scented oils to the drapes and a perfumed cloth placed under her pillow. Viewed through the lens of modern hygiene standards, Elizabeth's bed was nothing short of a nightmare. The bedding materials, once plush and luxurious, became petri dishes for parasites. Insects spread pathogens and caused bites that left her with welts, rashes, and sleepless nights. The absence of a proper laundry ritual meant that sweat, oils, and human dander accumulated unchecked. The reliance on incense and herbs masked the symptoms rather than treating the cause. And yet, the Queen remained steadfast in her acceptance. She deemed the price of infestation a small one to pay for the preservation of her royal image. Thus, each dawn found Elizabeth I rising from her parasite-infested bed as though she had slumbered on clouds of silk, her reputation untarnished by the crawling legions beneath her. The heavy velvet curtains closed around a secret. No portrait could show an empire resting on a throne built as much on illusion as on the living, breathing subjects who served her. And in that quiet deception, the Queen upheld the myth of unassailable majesty, even as she lay each night amid the ceaseless stirrings of a royal menagerie of mites and fleas. Horrific hygiene habit number 5. The royal wardrobe, that was never washed, only air, dried. In the hushed corridors of Tudor palaces, where rich tapestries muffled footfalls and the scent of incense lingered like a memory, Queen Elizabeth I's garments told a story of luxury entwined with neglect. To launder the exquisite brocades, silks, and velvets that draped her magnificent frame was to risk destroying threads spun and embroidered with painstaking artistry. The harsh soaps of the age made from wood ashes, animal fats, or even stale urine threatened to fade colours and weaken fibres. Thus the Queen came to possess thousands of opulent outfits that were almost never washed. Instead, they were hung out to air dry in the lofty wardrobes, gently wafted with fragrant herbs, or lightly fumigated with smouldering bundles of rosemary and lavender to mask odours. Each morning, as pale light crept through stained-glass windows, Elizabeth would select her attire from row upon row of silken gowns. Under the outer gown, she wore not one but 4 to 6 layers of undergarments. The linen shift, stiff petticoat, farthingale hoops, tightly laced bodice, and multiple underskirts. These layers, rarely removed except for major occasions, absorbed sweat, lead-based face powder, body oils, and dust from the stone floors. The undergarments, once crisp and clean, gradually conformed to her body, carrying the imprint of her form but also the stench of days spent in the royal court's humid air. Despite occasional airing in sunlit galleries, the layers never felt fresh to the touch. The corset she fastened each dawn had a rigid structure, whalebone or steel stays that compressed her waist, supported her bust, and sculpted the silhouette demanded by Tudor fashion. Yet that very corset bore down on her flesh so tightly that the skin beneath would break, crack, or even bleed. Queen Elizabeth often required attendants to discreetly dab at these wounds with aromatic oils rather than cleanse them with water or ointment. Her petticoats, heavy with their own weight and the weight of her humiliating secret, rubbed raw the backs of her knees and hips with every step. When she walked through the throne room, the layers of skirt and farthingale moved with a sonorous rumble, a rolling thunder of cloth, as one local mayor described it. After her carriage passed, courtiers reported a trailing whisper of stale humidity and worn fabric, so distinctive that they called it the royal musk. No one dared complain of the odour, for to offend the Queen in such a manner was to court disgrace. Rather, stained and pitted hems became badges of her presence, much as the iron-wrought shoes she wore became silent witnesses to her daily suffering. At the end of each day, Elizabeth's gowns were carefully rehung on wide wooden pegs inside a secluded armoire. There, they were lightly brushed with soft feathers or sprinkled with dried flower petals. Rainy days brought no respite. Wardrobes were sealed and smoke from a handful of herbs was allowed to drift among the garments, the hope being that the scent would overpower the persistent tang of sweat and mildew. But the musty underlayers, hidden from view, continued to harbour microorganisms that feasted on the oils and sloughed skin cells. Should a notable ball or diplomatic reception be scheduled, Elizabeth's chosen gown would sometimes undergo a token spot cleaning. Attendants ever wary of damaging the fabric would sponge at a visible stain with diluted wine or rosewater. But such ministrations seldom reached the deep creases or the undersides of skirts, and the damage of neglect accumulated. The Queen's favourite black velvet robe, blackness once as deep as midnight, faded to a dull charcoal and developed a patchwork of dust and grime near the hem. On rare occasions, ministers or foreign dignitaries might venture a compliment. "Your Majesty's attire remains impeccable," they would say, eyes averted from the damp corners of her petticoat. They mistook absence of visible filth for true cleanliness. In truth, the Queen's legacy of garments was a testament to her unwillingness to expose any part of herself to water a reluctance born of superstition regarding broken humours and prophesied weakness. And so Elizabeth moved through her realm in layers of unwashed cloth, her every gesture accompanied by the silent testimony of fabric saturated with her labours and her fears. Each gown was a cocoon of luxury hiding decay, each underlayer a shield against the notion that water could ever be a healer. The Queen's wardrobe, once a symbol of unassailable power, remained beneath it all an ecosystem of human detritus and silent suffering. Thus, the tapestry of her reign was woven not only from gold and silk, but from the stubborn refusal to cleanse the very garments that clung to her like a royal shroud. Horrific hygiene habit. Number 6. The scented gloves that concealed filthy hands. In the hush of early morning, before the corridors of Whitehall stirred with commotion, Queen Elizabeth I would summon her ladies-in-waiting to assist with what she considered a most indispensable ritual, adorning her hands with fragrant gloves. Bathing those aristocratic fingers in soap and water was strictly forbidden, a practice that she believed would wash away her royal vigour. Instead, she used a single, dampened cloth soaked in rosewater, barely swabbing the surface, before slipping on sumptuous gloves made of fine leather or silk. Yet these gloves, though elegant and elaborate, served a far darker purpose: to conceal the grime, sweat, and stains that clung to her hands like a secret shame. Each glove was treated with a mixture of aromatic oils, clove, cinnamon, and rose, imbuing the supple material with a heady perfume. When she entered the great hall for a formal audience, the sight of her gloved hands was as much a declaration of power as the crown upon her head. Every movement, every delicate lift of the hand to acknowledge a bow was accompanied by the soft rustle of leather or the gentle whisper of silk. Courtiers noted that she would only remove her gloves for the most solemn of occasions, the wedding of a favourite cousin, or the swearing in of a new ambassador. Even then, the gloves were removed slowly, ceremoniously, and only to reveal a single finger at a time for the exchange of a formal handshake. Beneath those gloves lay hands marred by the court's relentless demands. Dirt from the stables, smudges of lead-based makeup, and the lingering residue of oils used to mask the Queen's own body odour. Her nails, never trimmed, had become darkened with embedded dust and grime. When she finally withdrew her gloves, the first glimpse of skin was startling. Cracks of blackened dirt, streaks where perspiration had mixed with powder, and the unmistakable scent of charred wood ash left over from palace hearths. Her ladies-in-waiting kept a discreet distance, lest the odour of decay betray the Queen's carefully cultivated image of perfection. In royal correspondence, the wearing of gloves had evolved into a ritualistic code. Gloves are not to be removed, except for the most formal of handshakes, the court circulars declared, emphasizing that the gloves were as essential as the sceptre in symbolizing her authority. For foreign ambassadors, the very act of Elizabeth slowly peeling back her glove to extend her hand was a demonstration of the court's grandeur and the monarch's supreme command of etiquette and ritual. They would watch, transfixed, as her ivory glove slipped off her slender hand, revealing a still damp palm and fingers flecked with vestiges of her nightly rituals. Complementing her gloves, Elizabeth also carried a pomander, a small spherical pouch of cloth, filled with vinegar-soaked herbs and spices, tied to her waist by a delicate ribbon. Whenever she felt a whiff of stale air or the faint stench of sweat escaping from beneath her gloves, she would lift the pomander to her nose, inhaling its tangy aroma as though it could purify the very air around her. In reality, the pomander served to mask the odour of festering skin and the broken humours believed to reside beneath her gloves. Court observers wrote that after close contact, guests would discreetly excuse themselves to wash their own hands, the mere touch of Elizabeth's gloved palm leaving them uneasy and unsettled. True sanitation would have required soap, water, and time for cleaning, a luxury the Queen believed she could not afford lest she risk her strength. Instead, the layered defence of scented gloves and the occasional sniff of vinegar-soaked herbs became her hygiene protocol. But this protocol only deepened the filth it sought to hide. Bacteria proliferated in the damp warmth of the gloves. Fungal spores found new homes in the folds of silk. By the end of a long day's court, the inside of her gloves would be stained and damp, exuding a sour musk that no spice could entirely mask. Yet Elizabeth held fast to her belief that any contact with water threatened her vigour. Each dawn she would don a fresh pair of gloves, misted again with clove oil and rosewater. Each evening, those gloves would be carefully removed and stored unwashed in a cedar-lined chest, the drying process relegated to sunlight and whispered blessings of herbal smoke. In her mind, she was preserving her majesty. In reality, she was preserving an ever-growing repository of microbial life clinging to her royal hands. And so, day after day, gown after gown, handshake after handshake, Queen Elizabeth I maintained her exquisite facade, even as her gloves became a barrier between her subjects and the decay that festered just beneath her beautiful exterior. It was a grotesque testament to an age where rituals surpassed reason, and the Queen's own hands, symbols of her power, were left to rot hidden beneath the velvet and leather of her scented gloves. Horrific hygiene habit number 7. lead, induced madness, and the removal of all mirrors. As the decades passed and Queen Elizabeth I's elaborate layer of makeup began to exact its toll, her once radiant skin fell prey to dryness, fissures, and oozing sores. The very lead-based white paste she applied to conceal imperfections had turned her flesh grey and papery, cracking along her cheeks and jawline. With each layer of poisonous cosmetic, Elizabeth sank deeper into a kind of self-betrayal. Eventually, she issued a decree: remove every mirror, reflectant surface, and shiny metal fitting from her presence. No looking-glass was spared. Mirrors in her bedchamber, the garderobe, and even the throne room were unmounted and locked away. Polished basins, once gleaming with promise of fresh water, were covered or sealed for fear that their faint reflections might betray her true condition. Early mirrors of the 16th century, crafted from tin-plated glass, had never offered a perfectly sharp image, yet they were sufficient to reveal the dullness of her complexion, the peeling edges of her lead paste, and the network of fine lines that marred her veneer of eternal youth. Elizabeth dreaded the moment she might catch even a blurred glimpse of the skin beneath her elaborate mask. Each time her gaze met a reflection, her heart would constrict with terror. She believed that to see herself as she truly was would shatter her royal spirit and expose her vulnerability to her enemies. Night by night, her fear escalated until no reflective surface remained in direct sight. Her private apartments were transformed into mirror-free zones. Walls became featureless expanses of tapestry or fabric, concealing any hint of gleam. Candles burned behind thick curtains, their flickering light blocked from casting even the subtlest silhouette. In audience chambers, attendants were instructed to turn metal drinking cups inward and wrap polished door hinges in cloth. The ritual of entering the Queen's presence now began with a careful survey of the room. Any glint of shine meant an immediate covering or removal. Visitors noted the oppressive atmosphere, a strange stillness, as though the halls themselves were wary of harbouring a single shard of truth. With the mirrors banished, the courtiers and Tudor physicians resorted to flattery and poetic praise to maintain the illusion of Elizabeth's perfection. Gentle verses, lauding her unsullied visage and ageless grace, were recited daily. Ministers penned flowery dispatches describing her features as luminous as the moon and untouched by time's hand. These concocted accolades were essential props in the court's grand pageant, a veneer that hid not only the Queen's physical decay, but also the corrosive effects of prolonged lead exposure on her mind. Some historians now speculate that Elizabeth's increasing paranoia, forgetfulness, and withdrawal stemmed in part from chronic lead poisoning, a slow descent into neurological damage masked by ceremony. Deprived of her own reflection, Elizabeth grew increasingly detached from reality. She moved through the palace as if in a dream, guided only by the voices of her attendants and the ritualized choreography of court life. Each morning she would ask one of her ladies, "How does my complexion fare today?" The answer was always a poem or compliment, never the truth. She accepted these assurances, though privately she recoiled at the faint sense of mercury and vinegar used to dissolve her makeup at night. Her sense of self became wholly dependent on the curated words of her court. No mirror, no reflection, only the echo of praise. This mirror ban extended even beyond the palace walls. Elizabeth forbade the shipment of polished metals or small mirrors to her distant residences, worried that a glimpse of herself in a gleaming goblet or a knight's shield might trigger her fear. Envoys were advised to speak of her beauty in universal terms, ensuring the myth of the Virgin Queen remained intact across the realm. Any record of her true appearance risked being confiscated or destroyed. In her final years, Elizabeth's isolation became absolute. She refused to meet physicians who insisted on examining her wounds under lamplight, fearing their instruments would reflect back her decay. She spoke only in whispers, extinguished torches rather than allow unguarded light to catch her features. The court adapted. Official portraits after a certain date were commissioned from standard mask-style templates, regardless of how her face actually looked. Each new image reinforced the same ageless visage, a collective hallucination shared by artist and observer alike. And so, Queen Elizabeth I drifted through her mirrorless world, a monarch removed from her own reflection. Behind the velvet and verse lay a woman unmoored, abandoned by every gleaming surface that might have reminded her of her humanity. In banishing the mirror, she banished the truth. What remained was a husk of ceremony and illusion, an empire built on the fear that the slightest glimmer of reality would unravel the very threads of her crown. Horrific hygiene habit number 8. Bathing once a month. Queen Elizabeth I famously declared that she bathed once a month whether I needed it or not, a statement that sounded as grandiose as it was brutally austere. In Tudor England, medical doctrine held that full immersion in water would open the pores and admit disease into the body's humours. Consequently, Elizabeth's monthly bath was no luxurious soak but rather a strictly symbolic ritual. Once every 4 weeks, her attendants would draw a shallow basin of warm water scented with rosewater or diluted herbal wine. This bath, barely deep enough to cover her wrists, ankles and heels, took place in a curtained alcove, accompanied by the soft rustle of silk and the muted glow of flickering candles. There was no soap, no sponge, and certainly no scrubbing of the back or torso. The Queen merely dipped her hands, lower arms, and feet into the perfumed water, letting the scented liquid lap against her skin for just a few moments. A single attendant, wearing gloves infused with essential oils, delicately lifted her limbs in and out of the basin, then used a fresh cloth to dab away moisture. The rest of her body remained cloaked in the accumulated detritus of weeks, layers of dust from her multi-petticoated gowns, smears of lead-based makeup, and body oils that had mixed with sweat into a stubborn film. During the months between these monthly rituals, Elizabeth's chambers grew heavy with the mingled scents of her perfumes, court incense, and the ever-present musk that rose from her unwashed skin. Guests at court often felt their throats tighten when the Queen passed by, no longer from reverence alone, but from the heady, tangy odour of semi-stagnant moisture clinging to her garments. The perfumed clothing was sprayed, not washed, while her body itself remained largely untouched by water. In private, Elizabeth sometimes complained of itching or the tight, uncomfortable sensation of dried sweat beneath her bodices, yet she never questioned the accepted belief that water itself was a threat to her health. After the ritual bath, Elizabeth would stand on a plush towel in her chamber while ladies fanned her gently with feathers and handkerchiefs. With great ceremony, she would don a fresh set of undergarments, though these too had not been laundered, only aired and step into her familiar layered gowns. Each movement of her corseted torso prompted soft sighs of discomfort. The rigid whalebone stays pressed into her flesh, still damp from the scant water that had reached her waist. Yet the public never witnessed these private infirmities. To the realm, the monthly bath was proof of her dedication to hygiene, rather than the token gesture it truly was. Court physicians of the time did not object vehemently to this practice, for they held water in suspicion. Instead, they prescribed more applications of fragrant vinegar spritzed on her linens, herbal powders to be dusted into her hair, and the continued use of elaborate cosmetics. They offered elaborate explanations of humoral balance, asserting that hot water would crack her complexion or cold water would send chills through her spine. In reality, Elizabeth's teeth continued to blacken from sugar, her skin cracked beneath nasal heavings of lead paste, and scalp ailments festered under unwashing. Yet doctors remained silent, constrained by both superstition and courtly protocol. Diplomats recorded that after her ritual bath, the Queen's attendants still worked with gloved hands, avoiding any direct contact with her damp skin. Objects she touched, scrolls, goblets, chair arms, carried an intangible residue that attendants swiftly wiped with scented cloths. Even the air around her seemed filtered through a veil of fragrance, a carefully maintained illusion of freshness. But beneath that scented veneer, Elizabeth's body remained dehydrated, parched in areas untouched by water, and susceptible to rashes and infections from the unbroken barrier of makeup and powder. In modern terms, a single foot soak once a month is laughably inadequate. Proper hygiene demands regular cleansing of all body surfaces, and rinsing of dirt, oil, and dead skin cells. Elizabeth's bathing ritual accomplished none of this. It maintained the myth of her purity while allowing her to avoid the very element water that could have relieved pain, prevented infection, and restored some measure of comfort. Instead, it entrenched her in superstition, compelled her to endure suffering in silence, and deepened the divide between her public persona and her private reality. Thus, bathing once a month in the Tudor court was less a concession to cleanliness than a testament to the era's fear of moisture. It served the Queen's vanity and the court's need for spectacle, reinforcing the notion that water was more foe than friend to a monarch's body. And so, day after day, Elizabeth walked on in her perfumed garments, her skin cracked and coated in residual oils, bearing the irony that her monthly bath meant to renew her, only sustained her legend while slowly depleting her vitality. Horrific hygiene. Habit number 9. Indulging in sugar. Blackened rotten teeth. In the glittering courts of Tudor England, sugar was the ultimate symbol of wealth and power, and Queen Elizabeth I spared no expense in its consumption. From candied fruits lacquered in syrup to honeyed confections, sweet pastries, and rich spiced wines, sugar was served in abundance at every banquet. Yet in a time before modern dentistry, there were no toothbrushes, no minty pastes, and certainly no dental floss. Instead, Elizabeth resorted to the crude methods of her day, rubbing her teeth with rough cloths soaked in honey, wooden sticks dipped in ashes, or even handfuls of fine sand to scrub away the sticky residue of her sugar feasts. This primitive toothbrushing did more harm than good. The abrasive materials stripped away the precious enamel, accelerating decay. Court diplomats recorded in discreet letters that the Queen's teeth had become nearly uniform in their ruin, black as coal, fractured, missing in places, and grotesquely misshapen where molars once Saturday. Guests at her audiences often fell silent mid-conversation, noses wrinkling as the acrid stench of her breath. A fetid blend of rot, fermentation, and stale honey wafted through the chamber like a ghostly fog. To mask the odour, Elizabeth would discreetly chew whole cloves, dried flowers, or petals of rose. She tucked aromatic herbs into the corners of her mouth, hoping their scent might override the persistent funk of decay. Yet these measures were little more than a theatrical flourish, providing only fleeting relief. When she spoke to foreign envoys, the very air between them seemed to tremble with a momentary hush as they avoided her exhalations, only to offer polite smiles while inwardly regretting every inhale. Elizabeth's fear of pain was legendary. She refused the rudimentary dental treatments of her time, in which barbers or barber surgeons used rusted forceps and crude pliers to extract rotting teeth, procedures performed without anesthesia and often resulting in bleeding, nerve exposure, and infection. Rather than endure such torment, the Queen opted to live with her decayed teeth, for fear that a single yank might cripple her with agony. As a result, her mouth became a battleground. Gaps where teeth had fallen out, jagged edges of enamel, blackened stumps that wobbled with each bite of food. Over time, the absence of solid molars forced her to break her victuals into tiny pieces, and even then she chewed sparingly, wincing at every crunch. Her speech, once noted for its eloquence and authority, grew slurred and uncertain. Words lapsed into garbled sounds as she tried to avoid the sharp pain of contacting gum tissue or nerve endings. Nevertheless, she maintained the veneer of regal composure. Her smile, when it appeared at all, was a testament not to beauty, but to the rusted, crumbling remains of a queen's power eroding from within. Portraits commissioned by her court from the mid-16th century onward never revealed the true state of her teeth. Instead, artists depicted an idealized, unblemished mouth, another layer of illusion to conceal the gnawing decay beneath. The halls of her palaces soon grew accustomed to the hush that fell over the court when she addressed the assembly. Courtiers would fidget with their fans, nod politely, and try not to inhale too deeply. Some would excuse themselves to the outer foyer, claiming the need to refresh the throat, while others used embroidered handkerchiefs to cover their noses. All the while, Elizabeth continued her sugar-laden indulgence, believing that its sweetness marked her status as monarch of a burgeoning empire. In private councils, her physicians lamented her aversion to treatment. They pressed her to use antiseptic herbal rinses, infusions of rosemary, mint, or rue, but she dismissed such proposals as invasive or too wet. The pure luxury of sugar, she reasoned, outweighed the risk of decay. And so her dental disease advanced unchecked, a silent testament to her power and her fragility. By her final years, Elizabeth's rotten teeth had become a metaphor for the empire she ruled. Outwardly resplendent, yet inwardly beset by rot and corrosion, the blackened hollows of her smile mirrored the political intrigues at court. Every decayed cusp echoed the fissures that threatened her authority. Yet the Queen persisted, refusing to abandon her sugar-drenched indulgence or submit to the crude surgeries that might have saved her from the slow collapse of her oral health. Thus, the Queen of England, who once stared down armies and defied popes, found herself brought low by a substance as sweet as treason. Her love of sugar, her fear of pain, and her disdain for water combined to create a fate as tragic as any Tudor tale. A ninefold horror, encrusted not in jewels, but in the blackened decay of her own teeth. Horrific hygiene habit number 10. Applying a toxic lead face mask. In Tudor England, Venetian ceruse white lead powder was prized across Europe as the secret weapon to conceal smallpox scars and proclaim one's status as royal and eternal. For Queen Elizabeth I, this toxic cosmetic became more than mere makeup. It was an armour of perceived immortality. Each morning, her ladies-in-waiting prepared a thick paste by steeping pulverized white lead in vinegar, then blending it with whipped egg whites or rose water. This viscous cream was applied not only to her face and neck, but on some days of special ceremony, even to her hands and décolletage. Under the dim glow of candelabras, Elizabeth would hold still as attendants painstakingly smoothed the chalky mask over every visible inch of skin. As the ceruse dried, it hardened into a porcelain-like shell. Ever so gently, the Queen might feel the stiff tension on her cheeks as the mask set, cracking in delicate fractures. Once the paste began to flake, attendants would peel away the brittle shards, revealing beneath a mottled network of raw cuts and bleeding pores. Yet instead of ceasing, Elizabeth demanded a fresh application, often thicker than before to conceal the new wounds. Thus was born a cruel cycle. The more her skin cracked and bled, the more lead she plastered on to hide the damage, each layer inflicting deeper injury. The lead in that white mask seeped into her bloodstream through those open wounds. Chronic exposure to lead wrought its invisible havoc. Anemia that left her pale even by Tudor standards, pounding headaches that echoed like distant drums, tremors in her hands that occasionally betrayed her composed exterior, and relentless fatigue that weighed on her spirit. Court physicians speculated upon humoral imbalances, but, constrained by superstition and protocol, offered little relief. They prescribed more herbs, more powders, more elaborate rituals, yet no cure for the poison accumulating in her veins. When Elizabeth appeared at audiences, she sat statuesque beneath the flicker of wax candles, her expression serene and unblinking as though carved from ivory. Visitors whispered of the unsettling stillness of her features, skin so unnaturally white it seemed almost ethereal, but glancing closer they might have smelled the faint tang of vinegar mingled with sweat. To mask the acrid scent of peeled lead, the great hall was filled with vases of fresh blossoms and censers of sweet resinous incense. Even so, the heavy air sometimes carried a whisper of chemical bitterness that prickled the nostrils of courtiers. Discussing her cosmetic routine was strictly forbidden. Any mention of lead-based makeup was considered a grave affront to royal dignity. Courtiers dared not speak its name. Instead, they praised her unblemished radiance and timeless glow, weaving elaborate compliments into the tapestry of courtly flattery. In letters, foreign ambassadors portrayed her visage in glowing terms that omitted the toll beneath the mask. To admit the toxicity of her cosmetics would have been to shatter the carefully constructed mythology of the Virgin Queen. Over time, Elizabeth's physical and mental health suffered profound damage. Lead-induced neurological decline may have contributed to bouts of paranoia and detachment. In the privacy of her chambers, she sometimes recoiled from her own reflection, fearing the mask of makeup would slip and reveal the ravaged flesh beneath. Yet she persisted, convinced that beauty demanded sacrifice and that her people required the illusion of her perfection more than her health. By the end of her reign, Queen Elizabeth I had become a living embodiment of Venetian ceruse. Outwardly a flawless pearl of a monarch, inwardly a body corroded by the very symbol of its grandeur. The hallowed makeup that once proclaimed her divine right now whispered of her slow undoing. Each ceremonial application, each brittle flake removed, was both a performance and a confession. Beauty at once the mask of power and the instrument of her own undoing. Thus, the queen who defied popes and empires found herself quietly undone by lead-laden paste. Her final legacy was neither victory nor defeat on the battlefield, but a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of an immortal image can become a fatal trap, one layer of toxic mask at a time. Horrific hygiene habit number 11. Powdered wig, a lice breeding ground. Queen Elizabeth I never mourned the loss of her once lustrous hair so much as she dreaded allowing anyone to glimpse the bald patches left by smallpox in her youth. In place of her natural locks, she wore elaborate wigs crafted from horsehair, human tresses, and stiffened cloth, all bound together with a homemade paste of gelatinous glue. These wigs were never washed or cleaned. Instead, her ladies-in-waiting would dust them liberally with lead-based powder and mist them with scented waters before each wearing. The result was a dense, powdered coiffure that concealed her scalp but also trapped moisture, creating the perfect habitat for lice, nits, and other parasites to flourish. Each morning, Elizabeth's attendants would lift one weighted wig from its cedar-lined stand, gently shake away visible debris, and then, wearing leather gloves, arrange the piece atop the Queen's head. No hands ever brushed directly against her scalp. Using fine ivory picks and slender wooden tools, they coaxed each curl into place, careful to avoid ruffling the nest of vermin beneath. The powdered surface masked any stray lice, nestling them among the coarse hairs where they fed on her skin and laid eggs in the glue-slicked crevices. As weeks passed, the lice multiplied, their eggs hatching unseen by human eyes. Beneath the powdered wig, Elizabeth's scalp suffered continuous torment. Itchiness rose to a burning ache as she resisted the urge to scratch, lest she dislodge the carefully arranged curls and reveal her secret vulnerability. When small, infected sores formed from her frantic scratching, her attendants dared not apply water or salve. Instead, they quickly dabbed tiny wads of linen with aromatic vinegar before arranging fresh powder over the sore spots. The Queen sat motionless during these ministrations, her jaw clenched, her pale eyes distant. To speak might displace a curl or send a flake of lead powder drifting to the floor. Many of those who assisted with her daily hair ritual fell ill. Court records mention that several ladies-in-waiting developed severe scalp rashes and eczema after repeated contact with the infested wigs. Some caught lice themselves, suffering the indignity of their own infestations. Yet no one outside the inner circle dared complain. To challenge the Queen's beauty routine was to court disgrace. Thus the cycle continued, unbroken by any call for hygiene or relief. When Elizabeth retired at night, the wig was placed back on its wooden stand, still heavy with its population of lice. There it lay, dormant in the folds of hair. Until morning's purification, another dusting of powder and spritz of rosewater coaxed the parasites back to life. This endless reuse transformed the royal wardrobe into a generator of disease, each powdered wig a time capsule of the Queen's own biological detritus. The Queen's fear of exposing her true scalp persisted, even as her strength waned in her final years. She refused to let any physician inspect her infected sores or remove the matted weight of her hairpieces. The idea of shaving her head or wearing a new, clean wig was unthinkable. Such an act would betray the myth of her unyielding majesty. Instead, she clung to her powdered wigs and the accompanying robes and scented gloves as her last defences against the unrelenting assault of parasites and the ravages of time. In public, Elizabeth's silhouette remained majestic. Each wig crowned her with an aura of power, every gown rustled with authority, and her gloved hands moved with regal dignity. But beneath that stately exterior lay a woman encased in the very lice and powder meant to preserve her image. The powdered wig, once a symbol of unassailable rank, had become a prison of itching, infection, and decay. Thus, the Queen of England, who defied popes and empires alike, found herself besieged by a host of tiny invaders on her own head. Her greatest vanity, the powdered wig, that proclaimed her eternal sovereignty, was also her most insidious enemy. And so, day after day, Elizabeth I wore her lice-ridden crown, each strand of hair a testament to her willing sacrifice of hygiene for the illusion of perfection. Horrific hygiene habit number 12. Layering heavy, unwashed undergarments. Beneath the resplendent brocaded gowns that adorned Queen Elizabeth I, there lay a hidden architecture of garments so elaborate and burdensome that they rivaled any suit of armour. Elizabeth wore no fewer than 4, and sometimes up to 6, layers of undergarments each day. The linen shift, multiple petticoats, the farthingale hoops, the boned bodice, waist cinches, and other stiffened supports. Each piece was a marvel of Tudor craftsmanship, constructed with whalebone or steel stays, tightly sewn panels, and hand-stitched seams. Yet while the outer gowns were displayed and paraded, these inner garments were rarely removed, let alone washed, due to the prevailing belief that laundering would destroy the fabric and thus erode royal dignity. In the age of Queen Elizabeth, cleaning textiles meant using harsh substances, lye soap, stale urine, ash, even mouldy fermentation byproducts, all of which bleached colours and weakened threads. A gentle rinse might leave silks and velvets in tatters. As a result, Elizabeth's undergarments, once pristine, soon became enormous. Sweat-soaked swathes of cloth steeped in lead-based makeup, body oils, and court dust. Each layer was worn for days, sometimes for an entire week, until it became fused to the next, forming a compact mass of textiles that clung to her body. Securing these garments was an ordeal in itself. The corset, fastened with numerous metal hooks and laces, compressed her torso into the era's fashionable silhouette. It elevated the bust and narrowed the waist, but at the cost of constricting her diaphragm. With each breath, Elizabeth felt the rigid whalebone stays push against her ribs. Her pulse would quicken, and faintness would flicker across her vision. Yet to loosen the corset was unthinkable, for it symbolized the unyielding standards of the throne she occupied. As night fell, Elizabeth's skin, starved of air, began to break beneath the pressure. Fine cracks marred her flesh where the seams dug in, and clear fluid seeped from these fissures. No cleansing occurred, water remained taboo, an agent of disease according to Tudor medicine. Instead, a lady-in-waiting would gently dab a soft cloth, soaked in rosewater or violet tincture upon each sore, masking the pain but not disinfecting the wound. By dawn, the area felt tacky with dried fluid and perfume, ready once more to be encased in the same layers of heavy fabric. Morning rituals commenced almost before sunrise. Elizabeth would stand in her private chamber as her attendants surrounded her, misting artificial essences, bergamot, ambergris, and musk to counter the sharp odour of damp cloth. The faint fragrance attempted to overpower the musty blend of perspiration, lead powder, and the stale presence of countless gatherings in candlelit halls. The resulting aroma, undeniably distinctive, came to be known colloquially as the royal musk, a scent that courtiers approached with both reverence and discreet avoidance, keen to conceal sneezes or coughs until safely beyond the inner door. Even the slightest misstep could be perilous. A gust of air might shift the layers, revealing a momentary glimpse of blood-stained cloth or a clasped seam splitting under strain. Elizabeth, mindful of her image, would continue her procession into the great hall as though every layer were weightless. The rustle of her skirt and the soft creak of boning echoed in the hush of onlookers, each step a measured ritual of power draped in fabric and pain. Courtiers took meticulous note of her attire in official letters and dispatches. Descriptions of colour palettes, embroidery motifs, and fabric high points were recorded with as much care as treaties and alliances. Historians of the day might catalogue the exact shade of her underbodice for special occasions. Jade green velvet for banquets, garnet silk for diplomatic receptions, without a whisper of concern for the toll on her physical well-being. To Elizabeth, the layers signified status, a living tapestry of wealth woven into her very flesh. The weight of the garments pressed not only on her body, but also on her spirit. Yet to shed them was unimaginable, a concession to vulnerability and a breach of the rigid decorum that defined her reign. Thus, she endured the suffocating embrace of cloth and corsetry, each step a testament to the heavy burden of sovereignty. In the dim glow of candlelight, the Queen moved with a stately grace that belied the agony beneath. Her dresses swept the floor in swathes of opulent colour, but the underlayers, the unwashed, sweat-soaked undergarments, did more than confer shape. They became a symbol of her iron will to upholding an image of unassailable majesty. Every oppressive fold of fabric served as both armour and shackle, a constant reminder that her body belonged not to herself but to the crown. Thus, Elizabeth I wore her thick, unwashed undergarments as she wore her crown, with unwavering conviction, no matter the personal cost. And so the 13th hour, the layering of cloth, wove itself into the legend of her reign, each layer of unyielding fabric, a quiet echo of the sacrifices made in the name of power, and the unrelenting weight of royal expectation. Horrific hygiene habit number 13. Sleeping wrapped in a heady brocade cocoon. When night falls over the Tudor court, Queen Elizabeth I does not simply climb into her bed and pull the blankets over her. Instead, she dons her heaviest, most elaborate brocade gown, an armor of silk and velvet, and lies down beneath its weight. Her attendants do not strip away her day's outerwear. Rather, they leave the topmost layer of gown in place on the mattress, convinced that heat held by feathers and fabric will banish disease. Thus begins Elizabeth's nightly ritual. She sleeps cocooned in layer upon layer of sumptuous but suffocating textiles. Beneath that shimmering exterior, however, a hidden world of microbes stirs to life. The day's accumulated sweat from hours standing before courtiers mixed with lead-based powder and body oils has soaked into each thread. As darkness settles and her body heat permeates the layers, the brocade becomes damp, like a giant sponge pressed against her skin. The mingled scents of stale perfume, mothballed fabric, and bacterial fermentation intensify, creating an invisible fog of odor that hovers around her sleeping form. Elizabeth endures sudden bouts of itching that flare along her spine and thighs, sharp reminders that she is wrapped in a living blanket of germs. Yet she believes this humid confinement will activate the body's own healing, a conviction that keeps her from loosening the brocade shroud. Every shift in her sleep produces a soft, creaking rustle, an eerie midnight melody that fills the hush of her bedchamber. At times, a small patch of mold peeks through the folds, evidence of the bacteria feasting on the fabric's inner layers, but no one dares remove or clean the garment. It is an unspoken rule. The sanctity of the royal bed must remain untainted by laundry. As the candlelight dims, a gentle knock heralds the stealthy entrance of a lady-in-waiting. She carries a damp cloth lightly scented with rosewater, which she presses against the gown's surface to camouflage the sour tang of sweat and mold. The stained sheets and pillows, though faded and threadbare, are never changed. They are simply smoothed out and misted with fragrant oils to give the illusion of freshness. This closed ritual bans the act of washing from the Queen's sleep chamber. No water, no soap, only the fleeting comfort of aromatic vapour. At dawn, Elizabeth emerges from her brocade cocoon, the gown still moulded to her form and mottled with faint greyish-green patches of dampness. Those who attend her glimpse the lingering odours on the fabric, old sweat, dusty powder, and the faintest undercurrent of mildew, yet they bow their heads in silent reverence. For in the Tudor mindset, the royal scent is proof of her enduring power and sanctity. No courtier would dare breathe a complaint, for to question the ritual is to question the Queen herself. Night after night, this practice transforms the royal bed into a vast incubator. Yet Elizabeth remains convinced that it is the only way to preserve her health and ward off afflictions. Each morning she rises refreshed in her belief that the stagnant warmth has shielded her from disease. The brocade cocoon, heavy though it is, becomes her talisman, a living testament to the power she wields and the sacrifices she endures. In those hours of silent sleep, the Queen's body is both protected and imperiled by her own devotion to luxury, wrapped in layers that symbolize the weight of sovereignty itself. And now, as night has fallen deeply, let us take a slow, gentle breath, allowing every worry and burden of the day to dissolve with the rhythm of our breathing, like wispy clouds drifting across a twilight sky. Let your spirit drift upon those layers of brocade that once felt so heavy, transforming instead into a comforting warmth that soothes every trembling cell weary from the day. The tale of royal hygiene, secrets of pearl powder and cumbersome gowns, has become as evanescent as morning mist, blurred and distant. The final image, the brocaded bed, shrouded in an ancient dynasty's hidden legacy, slowly melts into the darkness, making way for stillness in each of our minds. We can smile, knowing that no matter how distant the past, no matter the opulence or horror, humanity ultimately yearns for a place of peace, a true warmth, and a restful slumber. The message woven through this story is more than a cautionary note on hygiene and health. It reminds us of the value of simplicity, of cherishing each serene moment with loved ones, not allowing trivial troubles to cloud our sleep or blur the tranquility in our hearts. Perhaps its greatest value lies in compassion and understanding that each of us, whether adorned with noble titles or clad in the simplest of garb, carries our own worries, needs the embrace of warmth to feel safe, and deserves a peaceful night's rest. And so, as your heartbeat finds its calm, as your breath merges with the quiet of the night, let that final image dissolve softly like the last candle, flickering out in an old chamber, leaving only the vast expanse of the starry sky above, Gentle as a whispered promise, peace will always find you, even when today brings sorrow, even when today brings worries. And with that tender whisper, we close this tale, close another long day, and gently close our eyes, inviting soothing dreams to cradle our souls. Sleep well, my dear friend. Don't forget to subscribe, so that each night we may immerse ourselves together in new stories, wondrous images, and the most comforting messages. Good night.